This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
During the first wave of coronavirus last year, rural areas became a safe haven for many people. We all saw the migrants walking back to their villages for safety and survival. But this time, rural India is badly hit by the virus and the stigma still prevails.
The second wave of the COVID pandemic raging across India has hit rural India, putting a greater burden on healthcare infrastructure, which has already been stretched to the hilt.
Migrant labour once again have started returning from big city centres to their villages, a sure indication of loss of jobs.
The deadly COVID-19 virus has made its way into the rural heartland. The pandemic is no more primarily an urban story like it was in 2020. COVID cases may be declining in the cities, but district-level data reveals a surge in cases in small towns and rural areas. Around 65% of India lives in rural areas, where testing continues to be low and medical infrastructure leaves much to be desired. As people struggle with the pandemic, economic data is also raising concerns. The number of people registering for the jobs under the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has increased to 40 million in April from 36 million in March 2021. CMIE data reveals that rural unemployment rate has increased to 7.13 in April from 5.81% in January, with women being hit the most. Many analysts feel that India is staring at a protracted slowdown as the pandemic wreaks havoc in rural India. The rural demand last year was resilient and supported the country's economy. But where are we headed now? What is happening in our villages, and why should we be concerned? From the Economic Times, I'm Rachita Prasad, and you are listening to The Morning Brief. We have three guests with us today who track the rural India from different lenses. Our first guest, Sunil Kumar Sinha, Principal Economist, India Ratings and Research. He has been closely tracking the rural economy and its impact on the country. Our second guest is K Ramakrishnan, Managing Director at Kantar, which is a leading data insight and consulting company. Better known as Ramki, his team closely tracks consumption in rural India and predicts trends. And our third guest is Neelesh Misra, founder of Gaon Connection. He and his team of journalists are on the ground chronicling rural India, telling stories of people behind the data. Welcome to the podcast, Sunil, Ramki, and Neelesh. Let's start with Sunil. Sunil, the data on COVID cases, joblessness coming from villages is not very encouraging. I mean, COVID has spread widely and medical costs have gone up. One wonders how the people in villages are dealing with this. Is there a stress building up in rural economy? What is your sense right now?
Whether urban or rural India, the stress is visible. And as you rightly said in the beginning, but again, when one looks at the whole issue of stress from the economic angle, then certainly I can say that situation are not going to be as bad as it was last year. Because last year, firstly, we didn't know much about the COVID and related issues. So we went into a complete lockdown for 2 months. So no activity. And thereafter also when economy started opening up, it took quite some time for economic activities to pick up and gather momentum and so on and so forth. But this time when the second wave has hit us, at least, although in terms of, the spread and its impact on the life is much more pronounced than it was in the first wave. But nevertheless, in terms of economic activity, things do not look as bad as it was in the first wave, simply because the lockdowns are not a kind of a complete lockdown and a countrywide lockdown. These are more regional in nature, local in nature. When I sum it up in terms of GDP growth, then of course the GDP is likely to be somewhat lower than our estimate, which was there in the month of January and February. But it is unlikely to be as bad as it was last year, because last year the overall GDP growth was -8%. And this year, our estimate in the month of January, February was that GDP will grow at about 10.4%. But due to the second wave, we have revised it downwards to 10.1%. As compared to last year, things are going to be very different in the rural areas. However, the way to look at it is that whether we want to look at the rural economy from the production perspective or the consumption perspective. I mean, if I look at the whole issue from the production perspective, then we had another round of bumper Rabi crop, and overall agricultural production has been fairly robust. We will again have a food grain production in excess of 300 million tons. So that is not a concern. But the concern is that now that COVID has reached the rural areas, the behavior and the impact of COVID-19 in the rural areas this time around will be very similar to what we saw in the urban areas in the first round. So what we are staring at is that despite a good production, it is unlikely that rural areas will repeat the level of consumption that we saw last year.
Rightly said. So we're talking about consumption. Ramki, you have been looking at the rural space very closely on that aspect. Sunil said that, the spending in the rural areas could be impacted. How different has it been in the second wave in these areas? And what does it look like going ahead?
Firstly, if you look at the rural spending basket, a large part of it is towards food, and the rest is towards other forms of consumption. So when you look at food, or when you look at, let's say, the FMCG basket as a whole, rural growth rate has more or less matched the urban growth rate if you look at a MAT period of till March. And if you look at by a quarter-wise series of growth at an overall FMCG basis, it would appear that in quarter one, which is Jan, Feb, March itself, the consumption in rural or the purchases in rural dropped down a bit. However, what needs to be remembered is when I say drop down, the metric that we are measuring is what is purchased by a rural household. So we kind of collate and sum all the purchases made in rural households and look at that as rural purchases or consumption.
And when you're talking about MAT, you're talking about the moving annual total,
that's absolutely
right?
And also, therefore, when we look at it, this figure is coming down compared to Q4. Q4, there was a growth rate of 6.6% over the same period the previous year, Q4 of 2020. And when we looked at the first quarter this year, it came down to 2.7%. But when you closer examine this, what it appears is that the largest component of this is definitely food. And within the largest component of food, wheat and atta may play a very major role. And there has been a substantial quantum of free wheat stroke atta that has been given through the public distribution system by governments across various parts of the country. As a result of which, the purchases of atta has dropped significantly. So therefore, a very large component of the basket has dropped because it is available free. So if you start looking at this data now without wheat and just because there has been some other input in the form of free giveaways, if you look at it that way, the drop is substantially lesser. In the sense, if I look at like to like, Q4 of 20 was 8.8%, it dropped to 6.9%. So it's not substantial at all. That's point number one. Point number two, even last year, when Sunil said earlier that we were underprepared in many ways in terms of tackling COVID and the impact that it may have on rural economy, even last year, we only saw growths right through the year, which means Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 were growths in terms of their consumption because the previous years were poor in terms of the FMCG consumption overall. However, the whole of last year we have seen growths, and we expect that growths to continue fundamentally because the fundamentals are right. One, the crop has been good, the harvest has been good, expectedly we'll have a good monsoon, and the registrations in MNREGA are more, which means there is more money available also. So all of these factors point towards a better amount of spending and consumption from a rural perspective. There are parts of spending which may see drops, like for example, auto, they expect to see a drop, more from the point of view of supply side than demand side really, because of the fact that factories are closed and they're not able to connect the stocks, etc. There is a drop, and similarly durables. But from a demand perspective, we don't see anything substantially different or lower in rural. So I would actually not be too worried about the negative overtones that are being heard extensively about rural India for this year.
That's interesting perspective. I want Nilesh to come in here. Nilesh, from what I understand, you have spent a substantial part of your time in the last 1 year in your village, and your entire team is actually on the ground covering developments in villages. What are the key trends emerging? I mean, what is the story looking like on the ground?
Firstly, we also have Gaon Connection, which is India's biggest rural insights platform. And we did the first national survey last year around July. And very quickly, I want to read as context some bullet points from there, because while I'm a person who looks more at faces than numbers, but some numbers to look at. More than 68% rural Indians faced high to very high monetary difficulty during the lockdown. 23% rural Indians borrowed money during that phase. 8% sold a valuable possession, either a phone or a watch. 7% mortgaged jewelry. 5% sold or mortgaged land. Skilled workers and manual or unskilled workers, work shut down completely, etc. Now, while we are not in those conditions this year, and I believe we are having to pay a huge human cost because we are not following those measures. A lot of the weight that came on the MNREGA, the Manrega scheme, last year, it completely, for the large part of the year, it failed a lot of rural people. Only 20% respondents told us that they got work under it, presumably because a large part of the district machinery was busy in tackling COVID. What this backdrop led us to is that we inherited this year a large number of people in debt, people without clear livelihood roadmaps. And in that scenario, what we are seeing on the ground, we are present in 425 districts of the country. We saw that last time, even though it was a very delayed reaction, but the Gram Panchayats, village head persons, were far more active than they are this year. The larger picture for us is that this is in an epidemic proportion growth this year in terms of the symptoms, in the number of suspected cases, and I'm using the word suspected because there's virtually no testing happening at the rural level. But UP's official data, for example, is that at least 50% COVID cases out of those measured are from rural areas, and this is in no way a correct representation because of the measurement issues. In the last week, some states have sort of woken up, and like UP is doing a 5-day house-to-house survey covering all of its 97,000 revenue villages. MP is doing something like that. But along with that, there is huge vaccine hesitancy. And B, there are a lot of rumors, false information, about what will happen if they go to get the vaccine. And secondly, about if they report themselves as having symptoms, what happens next? Will they be, locked away in some room of a hospital and never get to see their people again? Will the police come and take them away? Will their own village people ostracize them? I see a lack of intent and a lack of punitive action this time, perhaps because of the realization, because of the narrative that punitive action will lead to a loss in votes, will lead to a loss in livelihood. Of course, it has a drastic effect, but then the solution to that could have been to further re-entrench and reaffirm our PDS chain. And last year, we also, our same survey showed that those people with rations did get something. In many places, it was inadequate. Of course, those without rations, we had a figure of about 10 to 12% of those who we interviewed did not get anything or adequate help. But so I don't see that intent this time. And to me, state governments are saying that, hey, the court told us to do the panchayat elections. That doesn't do it for me. Of course, courts, the election commission, etc., should have stepped in. But at the ground level, I don't see what we saw last time. And now that the ferocity, the scale is kicking in with a massive human cost, we see some amount of strictness on this. And I hope it works. Again, also the availability, the people have had the first vaccine, whatever number of people have had. Second availability, they don't know when that will happen. So even where people are willing, or the nearest center to get tested could be 30 kilometers away or 50 kilometers away. So there are very different set of problems and realities in rural India, which I think are not being taken into account. And just a last point, I think any public health crisis, and if you look back, is often rooted in a very, very poor communication strategy. At the rural level, if people are not able to understand, and if we have not innovated well enough, we can't keep blaming people all the time. So I think there's a very large communication issue here also, which is feeding into the vaccine hesitancy, the rumors, all the false propaganda that's being done, similar to what we had during the polio cycle, when then, everybody pitched in. And I hope that that sort of an effort percolates to the ground, to the rural level.
Sunil, just to bring you here, with this in the background, with the fact that it's been a challenging year anyway, with prolonged farmers' protest and, COVID being the second wave being so merciless, and the elections, and there have been all these blips in what is happening on the ground. Now the monsoon season is coming up. We do understand that what happens in the rural area will have an impact on the national economy. How are these factors going to impact the upcoming Kharif season? Because, I don't want to cut off from the human story, but the fact is that these human beings are the ones who would be actually on the ground sowing. And if that is not taking place properly, then would there be concerns about food inflation going ahead?
I guess the rural story will have some twists and turns this year. For the simple reason that we all know that last year we witnessed a very stringent lockdown, reverse migration, etc., etc. As a result of that, last year when the Rabi crop was to be harvested, there was shortage of labor, and when the new Kharif season began, again there was a shortage of labor. But to some extent, with the lockdown getting lifted from June onwards, many of the farmers I know in Punjab, in fact, did their level best and actually fetched the laborers from wherever they were by, arranging buses or arranging alternate transport and so on and so forth. So all of that happened. Now, all of that became possible simply because this cohort, to a large extent, was not impacted by the COVID. So even though the fear of COVID was there, but at least because they themselves were not impacted and they could actually go back and do their economic activity. This time, the problem would be that a large part or large section of them will themselves be infected with the COVID. So they may or may not be available. So while monsoon is going to be normal, we'll have to wait and watch as to how the sowing season progresses.
Rightly so. And talking about essentials and discretionary demand, Ramki, you are looking at FMCGs very closely, but you also do track trends on durable goods and auto. Help me understand what are the trends indicating right now? Sunil raised the question about demand side. What are the biggest concerns companies are worried about right now in terms of these trends?
Now, if you look at rural consumption, it has never been a straight line. Like somebody says, it's been like the walk of a drunken man, it's always been volatile. The 2 years of very good growth, and then it drops either because of monsoon or crop or one of the reasons, and comes back, etc. So we saw 17 and 18 being bad, 19 slowly coming back, and 20, in fact, in the second half, seeing some amount of growth. There was a discussion about borrowings going up and people having to sell stuff, etc. But unless there are 2 or 3 data points to say borrowing was lesser in the previous year or will be lesser in the current year, it's difficult to make a comment on exactly those. But that said, in the midst of all this, is there a consumption impact? Very clearly on essentials, there isn't any impact because essentials are essentials. They are just what they are. But discretionary, do we see a change in discretionary? Definitely we do see a change in discretionary. If you look at personal care products, I'm not talking about fundamental hygiene products like toilet soaps, etc. But if you look at a little more towards grooming and other personal care products also, there is a growth in rural. Certainly the issues that are facing organizations or brands in terms of this consumption story right now, in my view, is not demand led, but it is more supply led. From the point of view of being able to connect at the right time, the right way, and the right pricing at which it is to be delivered. So, in my mind, consumption is not a bad story even today. Definitely not for essentials, and to some extent for discretionary as well. Despite the fact that there is a raging pandemic, that's the sum and substance of what I'm trying to say.
We will definitely keep an eye on that. Neelesh, just to get you here, I mean, clearly from this discussion, we can see that there are some things that the statistics reveal and there are some things that the numbers cannot just capture. Just to kind of get a sense from you, tell us what are the biggest challenges people are facing from the anecdotal experience from ground zero.
I recently went on Twitter and asked people to tell me what's happening in their villages, whether they're living in a village or their relatives or friends are. And, I got hundreds and hundreds of responses from different parts of the country. And the picture they showed, the Panchayat Chunav has acted like a carrier of the virus. Another person called Jay Azad said, मेरे मामा का पूरा परिवार पिछले 10-12 दिन से हर सदस्य बुखार और सर दर्द जैसे लक्षणों से ग्रसित है. मामा क्या, मौसी बुआ के यहाँ भी गांव का वही हाल है, ना कोई टेस्ट, ना कोई इलाज, बस अपने अपने हाल पर सब हिसाब से अपनी अपनी दवा दारू कर रहे हैं. दिस इज इटावा डिस्ट्रिक्ट विलेज नगला जयलाल, मधुबनी बिहार. मम्मी पापा दादाजी सब वहीं रहते हैं. वैक्सीन सफिशिएंटली अवेलेबल है, पर उधर बेड्स और ऑक्सीजन की कमी है. टेस्टिंग हो जा रही है सदर हॉस्पिटल मधुबनी में. There was a spate of messages that reported that there's an unusual rise in the number of deaths. People have said, 15 people, 30, 40, up to 40 people died this month or the last few weeks in our villages. And again, I mean, as responsible media persons, we cannot attribute those deaths to COVID because they were not tested or established as such. In messages after message, there is a desperation. Who do they reach out to? How do they reach out to people? How do they take their patients? And I think this human cost, and this is linked to productivity. I mean, maybe the physical productivity will show a certain way. I'm not an expert. My colleagues here are far better, knowledgeable in that. But the way it has sapped the minds this time is definitely going to have an impact. Hunger. I mean, people are eating less. That is very, very well established as we gather from our feet on the ground, our community resource persons across all states. People are eating less. Anganwadis have been shut since last year. Imagine the extraordinary, astronomical impact of that on the long-term future of a child who does not get nutrition at this impressionable age. So I think a lot of the casualties of this disaster will never be caught on an Excel sheet.
That's actually true because there's a tracker created by a group of volunteers called ruralindia.help, and they are trying to connect initiatives in smaller towns and villages to people who want to either donate money or time. And some of the stories there make you understand that it's not just COVID relief. Everything else has been completely disrupted. People don't have the resources even to, run the initiatives which have been going on for a very long time. Sponsors are not sending the money. They, the logistics is completely disrupted. So yes, like you said, that these stories, are something that will be very significant and probably will not be captured in the numbers, but we need to kind of look at that as well. Ramki, you are optimistic about the road ahead, but given the environment and given even the numbers, sequentially, we have seen the growth rate has been slowing in the last few months in the rural demand. Where are we headed from here? Is this likely to continue? You did say you're not as pessimistic, but what do you see going ahead?
So I'm a very strong believer in fundamentals, Rajita, which is what are the factors that impact rural demand. All those factors are still strong. Yes, there is a very strong input which is negative, and a very strong input which, if it can become unmanageable, etc. But that said, rural India is really, really vast and very robust in terms of its ability to drive demand. And so, from that perspective, and the fact that the fundamentals are right for the country, I certainly believe that one doesn't have to be overly pessimistic about the pandemic's impact on consumption. I'm purely talking from a consumption economy. So, from that sense, I would still seem to think that the growth projections which we saw in the even the first quarter, I don't think we will go far away from that or far too negative from there. So, from that perspective, I believe the consumption, definitely the FMCG story is one that is not to be too bad, too adversely impacted in rural India across the country.
That's giving me some comfort. But Sunil, to get your final views on this, till last year, experts were expecting that, rural economy will be driving India's recovery. What now? What can the government do, especially given that they really don't have abundant resources? They are also operating within very constrained resources right now. What's your take on it?
The rural demand is not going to go away, the way probably the urban demand goes. And also, I mean, in the context of India, it is often said that India is not actually a demand constrained economy. It is actually a supply constrained economy. But having said that, I would also like to, say that, the kind of devastation that we are witnessing with the second wave and the way it has impacted or going to impact the rural India will be something which rural India may not have seen in many, many years. And that will have a lasting impact. The fact is that, the overall health infrastructure, if in urban areas cannot cope up with the second wave of pandemic, you can well imagine what the situation would be in the rural areas. And in many cases, even if you die with the COVID, probably will never come to know that this is what has actually hit you. So there is a human angle and there is a economic angle. So I think from an economic point of view, as I said in the beginning, two things will happen. Even when we look at the number of the first quarter of this fiscal and compare it with the first quarter of last fiscal, the number may still appear to be good, because last year first quarter was a washout because of the lockdown. So if you take all of these things into consideration, then I think broadly the story is, if not pessimistic, it is certainly very, very disturbing. And it's unlikely that we will be able to get back to the pre-COVID level story anytime soon, both in terms of output numbers as well as in terms of life and livelihood numbers. And lastly, even when I'm saying that the likelihood is that India will grow at about 10% in fiscal year 22. It's more of an optics, because last year was so bad that on a YOY terms you will see a 10% growth. But if you really draw a trend line, then even with 10% growth, our GDP will be almost 10.7% lower than the trend growth, which simply means that had COVID-19 not happened, where we would have been and where we would be now at the end of the fiscal year 22.
That makes sense. And like you said, there is an economic angle, there is a human angle. Nilesh, you very interestingly highlighted some of the issues that people are facing from the human angle. Before we wrap up, you are connected with a lot of villages through your initiatives. What would be your top suggestions if I were to ask you for the government right now? I mean, what can they do in short term? And if there are any long term initiatives that they can launch right now to help rural India, what would you say on that?
I'm preparing on behalf of Gaon Connection a 3-year plan for which we need support, and I hope that the colleagues on this panel and your listeners and readers can support us. It's called Revive. I feel that despite this entire catastrophic situation that we are in, and despite the migration of tens of millions of people, the one silver lining I see from where I am living in a village is that rural India never had more talent than it does now. There is a stereotype that has been peddled on mainstream media since last year, which is that all the migrants returning are laborers. No, they're not. We have data for about 2.3 million people. This data is from late last year who returned to UP. By that time, it shows that at least 30% are in either blue collar or white collar professions. So you have accountants, you have gym assistants, you have beauticians, and the kind. We are creating this blueprint called Revive, which is a rural entrepreneurship blueprint. Can they come back with a work ethic? It's like when somebody comes back from the West, they come back with a certain work ethic, and then they adapt themselves to build on those strengths here. So when people are coming back from cities, they're coming back with that strength. And we feel that the government should collaborate with organizations like us, with minds like my other two colleagues on this panel, and just come, on with a war footing to create new entrepreneurs, thousands of them. It could revive traditional crafts, which are dying. It could, using social media, using the internet, it could offer new services, new products, with the right mentoring, with partnerships like industry bodies. And I think that if we can set in place, it will address, not only create, great rural income and spur national growth, but also address a lot of the distress and the distress migration that happens and will certainly happen because it does in a cyclical manner after this pandemic eases out.
That's actually a very interesting initiative, and wish you the best for that. Neelesh, Sunil, Ramki, thank you very much for being with us today. Really interesting conversation, and a little bit of despair, but a lot of hope too in whatever you have said. So let's see how this pans out, and we hope things get better. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's all from us today. I'm Rachita Prasad, and you have been listening to the Morning Brief. This episode was edited by Bhavya Dilip Kumar and coordinated by Nehal Chaliawala. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. We look forward to your feedback. Write to us at themorningbrief@timesgroup.com. And if you liked this episode, please do share on your social media handles. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you for listening and have a great day.